Peace, prosperity, and blessings to all. Thank you for tuning in to this lecture that we're having today. This is centered around the origins of hoodoo because there's a lot of information out there about how did hoodoo originate, what's its origin, how does it work, what makes it have its essence, and how does it apply to the aboriginal and African descendants in the shores of North America. Let's go back to the birthplace of hoodoo because hoodoo wasn't birthed in books, it wasn't birthed in movies, it wasn't birthed in a church. It wasn't birthed in a temple. It wasn't birthed from structuralized civilization. The birth origins of hoodoo takes us back to southern slave plantations. On these plantations, there were many atrocities and things of that nature being committed at that time. And so the original people who were already here in North America, which we call the aboriginal melanated people, we were already here. Then colonizers brought additional Africans from Africa and blended them in to aboriginal slaves. So what originally happened when the colonizers brought Africans over here, they realized that, hey, there are brown and black people already here. They realized that immediately when they came into the shores of North Carolina, South Carolina, Florida, Virginia. They ran into the creek. They ran into the Choctaw. They ran into the Blackfoot. They ran into the Yamasee. They ran into the Seminoles. All of these original people were brown skinned, melanated people. So, what the colonizers actually did is they said, why are we taking voyages, 30-day voyages, traveling all the way thousands of miles from the coast of West Africa to transport people just to come here and find that the same people is already here? So what they did, there were certain aboriginal tribes that worked with the colonizers, the Creeks being one of them. From my research, the Creeks were definitely one of them. So they would go into the wilderness in America here and they would capture smaller indigenous tribes. Forgive me if I'm pronouncing that word correctly. They would capture smaller aboriginal tribes and they would deliver them to the colonizers in exchange for guns and other material means. This amalgamation of people that came from Africa mixed in, and mind you, there were just a little bit of people that actually came from Africa. History would tell you that it is millions and millions of people. That's not true. What is true is that millions of dark brown, melanated people already been here in America. So they brought a couple of 100,000 people from Africa, mixed them in with everybody, and then turn around and told everybody, you're from Africa. You all came on slave ships, which is responsible for how the memories of Aboriginal people were erased. So we all thought we came from Africa when in actuality, only about 2% of this population in America of dark brown melanated people actually came on slave ships. So when tribes such as the Creeks assisted colonizers by capturing smaller tribes and delivering them to colonizers for sale and for usage on plantations, this is how we got captured. And many of our ancestors were captured. And we were mixed in with the handful of Africans that came on slave ships. Now, as history continues, what we learn is that the plants of this land were unfamiliar to African people because this is a different type of tropical climate here in the shores of North America. So plants that grow here naturally don't grow naturally in Africa. Africa has its own plants that grew according to its climate. In America, we have our own plants that grow according to our climate. So, what happened? The question is, how did the Africans who were transported here learn the medicinal properties of the plants that are here? The answer, they had to have learned it from the Aboriginal people who already knew the landscape. They knew about the energy and properties of the plants that naturally grew in the shores of North America. All right. So now we have the understanding that the Aboriginal people who are already here in North America taught the Africans about the medicinal nature and the magical nature of the plants that they came in contact with here. Okay. So we, the Aboriginal people, were responsible for educating the African people. Now, the African people knew how to make magic, but they didn't know how to make magic, what they were working with, because they had to figure it out. They had to learn. And so we became the teachers of what is dandelion. We became the teachers of what are oak trees, pine trees, and other trees that are indigenous to America, but not Africa. Okay. So as the timeline moves on, we're all lumped up into one group of people in slave markets, plantations. Families were broken apart as people were sold. Some people's family members were sold across state lines. Families were broken up. Children were sold over there. mothers were sold over here, and fathers were sold over there. That was the first act of trauma that Aboriginal and African people experienced from the slave trade, as far as directly through the market of selling people, human trafficking. Now, when people's families were broken and they had to formulate new family structures on plantations, these new family structures that were formulated, some, if not most of them, were formulated through oppressive means. They were slave breeding. So they would take a man and take a woman, make them breed just so they can give birth to more slaves. Now, the hidden part about that is that you take this African man who knew the spiritual systems of the tribe where he came from in Africa, and you mated him with an Aboriginal woman who knew the plants and herbs of America. What we get is the birth of hoodoo. Now, people who were subjected to this type of treatment often took their spiritual, moral, cultural concepts and naturally combined them as a means of survival. So when you have people from different localities forced to live with one another, forced to be in some type of concubineship for the purpose of breeding babies, these people formulated bonds based on their ideas of life, based on their forced companionship. They exchanged knowledge and wisdom that they brought with them from their respective tribes. And this became the actualized origin of what hoodoo is to become. You see? So, moving even further, slaves were transported from plantation to plantation. Even those structures that were formulated were broken up. So, within the midst of all of this madness, information was being secretly exchanged amongst the slaves who came from Africa and the aboriginal slaves who were captured here in North America. So we, the aboriginal slaves, we begin to share knowledge amongst each other that under any other circumstances we wouldn't have shared. Because even in North America, tribes didn't exchange knowledge with one another. They exchanged goods, they exchanged services, but they didn't exchange knowledge. Not the intimate knowledge of their tribal workings. They kept those things secret. What the slave trade and slave labor and the presence of the colonialist did was force these people to exchange secret knowledge with one another as a means of figuring out a way to combat them. So if one tribe knew how to make poisons and another tribe knew how to make medicine, they would exchange that knowledge. So as they were being transported back and forth from different plantations, they could continue to share that knowledge with one another so that they can ensure, guarantee, or even create the possibility of their freedom. Now, another tool that was definitely used during this time frame was the drum. Drumming was an actual way of sonic communication with other plantations. See, this is something that a lot of people didn't know. And for this reason is why colonializers banned the usage of the drum on plantation, because one of the house Negroes went and told, they went and told, oh, master, they out there using the drums in certain songs, certain drum patterns to communicate with other plantations in the locality. So when they would plan a revolt, the slaves on this plantation would beat a certain drum beat. And the slaves on the other plantation would hear it. And they could sonically decipher what they were listening to. They say, yeah, we know that beat. That's a tribal beat. That beat means this. That beat means tonight we fight. You see? Once colonializers recognized what was taking place, they banned the drums on all plantations. In the laws of South Carolina, right now, 2025, the usage of the drum on paper is illegal. They never took it off the books. It's illegal. That's a reminder that how powerful our music, how influential our music was in liberation. So they banned it. This is why today there is a very strong concern by any colonizing agency to direct and redirect the momentum of our music, because they know Black people are vibrational beings on a high level. So we must control how they vibrationally express themselves. And it's not about money, it's about what you're saying, it's about how you're saying it, it's about the melody, the sonic vibration, the semantics of it. This is why record labels and the whole music industry has been flipped upside down from positive music to negative music, because they know we are sonically programmable and we respond to the sonics of the universe. You see? And this is why the drums were banned on the plantations. And this is why they control the beat. I call it controlling the beat. They control the beat. They want certain music out there so that they could control the beat. And by controlling the beat, they control your soul. You see? That's why they want negative music and the negative images associated with the negative music to prosper. See, they don't mind making you a millionaire mass propagating low vibrational sonics. They don't mind that because they know it's a give or take. Either we're going to make a handful of millionaires that's sonically doing what we want them to do versus having people sonically ignite the spirits of these people towards their own liberation and an awakening. So they would rather create, okay, we're going to create these millionaires over here as long as they keep their agenda in place. Now, many of them they know about it and choose to participate anyway. And many of them don't know because they are not fully awakened. Now, hoodoo continued to evolve after the so-called emancipation of the slaves. Because Christianity, what is known as Christianity, what I call the Europeanized version of Christianity, became a very powerful staple in American society as it continued to develop. Now, the development of Christianity was strictly based on the Europeanized conceptualization of what they thought African Christianity should sound like, of what they thought African Christianity should feel like or look like. So they controlled the indoctrination of not only themselves, but the people whose ancestors originally wrote the Bible. Africans in ancient Ethiopia wrote the Bible. Africans from melanated lands, melanated philosophies, melanated mathematics, all wrote what is known as the Bible. See, thousands of years prior, Europeans stole the books because the book was really scripts, fragments, separate books that were combined at the Nicaea Council in the 600 AD, somewhere in that time frame. And so what happened is after they went through the process with the Council of Nicaea and said to themselves, we stole this knowledge from the Africans, so what we're going to do is we are going to pick and choose what we want in our Bible. You see how that sounds? You steal knowledge from ancient Africans, take it to Europe, and then decide on what part you're going to keep and what part you're going to delete. So the books that they didn't understand, the books they didn't like, the books that didn't serve their purpose. They burnt them. But little do they knew is that the Ethiopian church up there in the mountains of Ethiopia had the original book already transcribed, untouched for thousands of years in its original language, Aramaic, Amharic, yes. You see? So what the Europeans stole, or what they thought they stole, was just a copy of the original. How they tricked the world is they took the carbon copy and said it was theirs, rewrote it in English, mistranslated words, and then created their own philosophy on what it all meant and used that as a tool when it came to America to indoctrinate aboriginal people whose ancestors wrote that knowledge. You see? So what they were reading, what the European colonizers were reading in that book and trying to interpret, the true interpretations was already in the spirits of the people, because the ancestors that wrote that knowledge lives within us. You see? We already knew we were the lost tribes. You had to figure that out. They had to figure it out. But we already knew that. So they used their idea of Christianity and imposed it on us. At that time, these black people, these aboriginal people who originally came up from practicing the hoodoo, soaked that knowledge in, but they never let go of their hoodoo. One of the main reasons why black people never let go of hoodoo is because even after the so-called emancipation of the slaves, black people couldn't go to white doctors. We couldn't. You go in the hospital, they'll tell you they need an operation just to kill you. There are many stories. If you would talk to the old people, talk to the elders, they'll tell you. You find somebody 60, 70, 80 years old, they'll tell you we were scared to go to their doctors because every time Aunt Betty go to the doctor, Aunt Betty get worse. Aunt Betty's husband went to go have a knee operation and dead. You see? Because these doctors were a part of a system that didn't care on how they eradicated black life. They didn't care. It was a perfect opportunity. They'll come in here and tell you, you need open heart surgery. You don't know if your heart is that bad, but based on the fact that they are recognized as professionals, experts on the subject, you go along with it, get on the operation table. Oh, she died in the middle of a heart transplant that she didn't even need. Ain't that something? You see? So as a result of that type of fear, the old people wouldn't go to doctors. They continued to practice, if not the magical aspects of hoodoo, they continued to practice the metaphysical aspects of hoodoo based on that fear alone. And so, through the practice of the metaphysical aspect, the medicinal aspects of hoodoo, they never forgot the magic of hoodoo. This is how the tradition stayed alive even after many of the Aboriginal and African people were indoctrinated with Europeanized Christianity. So now, when these hoodoo workers went into the church, they took their medicinal knowledge with them. This is what gave birth to the Kojic Church, the Church of God in Christ. Kojic. You know, Bishop Charles Mason was a root worker. It's another topic, another subject matter. But what we're expounding on is the fact that the hoodoo workers went in church with the medicinal knowledge. They grafted information from the Bible according to what they spirits remembered through ancestral connections. So they immediately understood the divinity of the Most High. They immediately understood the hierarchies of the angels and the guardians. They knew about all of that. So now what they were having is a tangible experience now with scriptures that supported their Aboriginal and African beliefs. It's just the fact that Europeans were trying to indoctrinate their minds into a different directions, but as the black church evolved, they moved away from that. Many churches moved away from the European indoctrinations of African spirituality. And they begin to reinterpret their ancestral wisdom for their best means by doing what's best for them, by relinquishing the philosophies that were taught to them, like the children of Ham being cursed and other Bible scriptures that were intentionally corrupted, intentionally warped, intentionally miscommunicated, just to keep the minds of the people enslaved, just to keep them feeling inferior. It was intentionally done. They knew better. They just didn't want you and I to know better. You see how that works? Okay. So now, what this did was create an inherent hatred amongst Black and Aboriginal people with the Bible. So we grew up hating the Bible, thinking that, oh, that's a white man Bible. That's the Bible of the colonizers. No, it's not. The colonizers stole it. That's our book, our knowledge. We were indoctrinated in the wrong way. We allowed someone else to come in and interpret our ancestral knowledge for us. We are the lost tribe. We are the children of Israel. But if you let them tell it, The real Israelites are over in Israel now. Those are not Israelites. Those are colonizers. The Palestinians know. That's why they ain't never gave up their land. They fight tooth and nail for their land because they know these people ain't the original Jews. They're imposters. We the original Palestinians, which are one of the 12 tribes. And you think we gonna let these imposters come and take land? They would rather throw a rock at an army tank before they let that happen. Facts. And so the indoctrination of the African and Aboriginal mind is what created a hatred towards Christianity. It's not the fact that we despise the Bible, or many of us despise the Bible. It's the fact that we are angry, internally upset with the fact that we received ancestral wisdom from the hands of a colonizer. And many of us can't reprogram our minds to say, hey, they were lying. They stole it. They lied with it. They used it to keep people captives. And now we took it back and we put it in its rightful place in our lives, which is to connect us to the Most High and the spiritual power of the angelic realm. So once we went into church, once the hoodoo workers went into church, they began to awaken those qualities and aspects within them that would align them with their destiny, with their ancestral knowledge. And this is why black churches broke away in so many denominations. This is what gave birth to the Kojic Church. This is what gave birth to the Southern Methodists and other denominations because they wanted to be able to interpret their ancestral knowledge for themselves. They knew the knowledge was good. They knew the knowledge was right and exact. But they also understood that coming from the hands of their oppressors, they're not going to get what they need to feed their soul. And this is what caused the breakaway of the churches. But in all of these denominations, they were hoodoo workers in them. You see? Because somebody had to be the doctors. Because even though at that time, still, they were afraid to go to European doctors because of what European doctors were doing. So they held on to it and they practiced their own metaphysical science in private. You see? So, yeah, every community, every church, as the black church broke away from the white church, every church had a root doctor inside of it. Every community had a root doctor inside of it. You see? And their primary position of service was to heal people with ailments, rashes, and belly aches, and headaches, and things of that nature. You see? And so, as time evolved, many of these older medicinal root workers passed away. They taught certain people in their family about the medicine and the making of the medicine, but even still, they knew the magic. Even if many of them didn't work the magical aspects of the medicine, they knew it. So now, as time evolved and it became necessary to use the magical aspects of the medicine, they would do that because they knew what it all meant. It just the fact that they needed the medicine at that time more than the magic because we couldn't go into their hospitals. We couldn't go into their clinics. So the demand for the medicinal aspect of hoodoo was greater. You see? So as we began to be accepted, honestly accepted into the hospitals and the idea of being treated fairly, I would say, grew, then people felt more comfortable going into hospitals and less confident going to root workers to be healed. So, as a form of survival, root workers resorted over to the magical aspect. Well, let me do some magic. They're trying to take your land. Let me do some work right here, blah, blah, blah. And we'll run them off away. So now the magical aspect began to be more popularized. Join me for part 2. This is Medicine Man on the origins of hoodoo. You guys have a very blessed and prosperous day.